morning and welcome to day 2 of the Interim Digital Summit. My name is Michael Cook. I'm the Director of Research at DT Consulting, and today I'm going to be moderating a panel, and the panel is going to focus on digital innovation. How do we stay ahead of the curve? Now, I'm sure all of us are aware that the life sciences sector is changing, and it's changing dramatically. We've got the rise of new digital disruptors entering the market space. Plus, we've also got technologies such as artificial intelligence, blockchain, IoT, cloud computing, advanced data analytics, changing the way life sciences business conduct their R&D, manage their supply chains, go to market through their commercial modeling, but also interact with their patients and their HCPs. Now, underpinning all of this are innovation commitments within these organizations. We need to make sure that we utilize these technologies effectively and intelligently. And innovation and digital innovation is really the way we structure that. So in today's panel, I've got 5 very esteemed members who are going to be talking us through their unique experiences and their perceptions of what digital innovation means, how we can really foster a culture of innovation within our organizations, and also some key takeaways that you as our audience can utilize tomorrow and in days to come as you get to grips with digital innovations. So to start off, let me quickly introduce everybody that's going to be sitting on the panel today. Firstly, we have Christina Carlos, who's the VP of Digital Innovation at Gilead Sciences. Next, we have Xuan Gui, who's the VP and Head of Global Digital Strategy from BMS. Next, Mike Riley, who is the Global Head of Supply Chain, Customer Connectivity and Digital Products from Johnson & Johnson. The next is Kiva Valili-Gilroy, who's the Head of Data Analytics and Strategy at Merck KGaA. And then lastly, but by no means least, Jeff French, the Digital Officer of Vive Healthcare. So everybody, welcome. Great to have you on the panel.
Nice to be here.
Thanks for having us.
We were just discussing before we went live that this is the first digital panel for a few of us on the call today. So it's a bit different, but it's quite exciting as well. So I'm really looking forward to this. I think innovation in particular is something that I'm very, very passionate about. And I'm really looking forward to getting the expert's opinion on what it really means and how it happens. But I think to start things off, let's kick off with Jeff and let's ask the fundamental question, why? Why is digital innovation so important?
Well, I mean, first we have to kind of think back in the industry a little bit and just remember that innovation is not something new for our industry. If you think about it from an R&D perspective, we've been doing it for many, many years. I think nowadays, as you start to realize kind of the pressures of the ecosystem of our industry, it's now asking us to kind of put innovation in a new gear, right? To start focusing its energy and its focus around things beyond just the R&D arenas. And that's actually what you're starting to see a lot of, and what a lot of us are starting to really feel day in and day out. And we're starting to feel it kind of on 2 levels, I think, as well. There's an innovation level that's really on a day-to-day, got to fix problems, kind of think differently, got to use data to really advance our thinking. But then also at the same time, because of that outward pressure, it's strategic innovation. It's thinking about, what are you doing to differentiate yourselves versus the competition? Because there's a lot more competition than there used to be. And so it really is about how can you think about everything and the innovative platforms on those 2 levels to drive a new way of thinking within your organization. And I've always felt kind of in those 2 levels are the best way to do it.
Yeah, Jeff, you've said something really interesting when you said that there's an awful lot more competition at the moment. What I find, I completely agree with you, but what I find as well is the diversity of competition as well. It is not just the standard, big pharma or even biotech that we're used to in the past. It's the technology companies getting involved, and it's the Amazons, the Googles, and that extra pressure on top of what we're trying to do, honestly, for me, I think is brilliant. It's really exciting. It gives me whole new things to think about and do, but it is definitely an extra pressure on top.
I would agree. I would say that the digital disruption, especially from some of the smaller companies, forces the larger companies to be more nimble, to work at a faster pace. And I think overall, it benefits the overall customer at the end and the patients.
And I think that's it, Mike. I think the idea of really thinking about innovation just beyond the molecule, right? So it's that customer experience. That's how you're truly going to differentiate. And that's, I think, what the tech companies have brought to the table, which is cost all of us in pharma to really think about this differently. How are we going to get that medicine to the patient? How are we going to do it in their own terms? How are we going to do it in a way that is just easier for them to get to treatment, to get to care? So completely agree with what you guys are saying.
Yeah, and on top of that, Christina, it's not even, you're completely right, but adding on top of that is the differentiators of what our medicine does. So what can we add on to the top? It's not just about the pill anymore, it's about the wearables, it's about the monitoring. You know, when we have patient groupings that are so much more tech savvy because technology is much more readily available, it's adding that extra layer of what else can we do differently that is more engaging to our patients.
Exactly.
Very true. And I think, you know, Kiva, when we had discussions previously, you know, and I posed this question to you at the time, you mentioned that it's not really about overcoming digital new threats in the industry. It's almost about taking advantage of new opportunities. Can you expand on that slightly?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a big believer in collaboration, and I think pharma in itself, we can't do everything at once. We can't develop and we can't really compete with the tech companies coming forward, because to build that those capabilities in-house will take years. It will take a vast amount of money, and we all know how expensive it is to develop a drug anyway. To start off with, throwing more money at it is quite difficult, but having more of those collaborative relationships, and we see an awful lot of it. I mean, COVID-19 is a prime example of how those collaborative relationships can actually work within our industry. And so for me, it is really leveraging the expertise of other smaller or new niche areas of business that will make us stronger as an industry.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think it's something that Jeff said earlier that really is the underlying piece to this, which is in the scientific world, we've really understood the experimental mindset and how we go from target validation to phase 1 to phase 2, phase 3, and so on. But somehow when it comes to digital, we haven't adopted that kind of mindset or that kind of experimentation type of approach. And that's something we need to learn in pharma to really start to think more in a phased approach rather than just going all in with the first shiny object we see, and really starting to think of these partnerships or trying out some of these startups that are trying to solve a very specific problem in a way that allows for them to really test and grow over time rather than just expecting them to solve the problem and go all in right from the start.
Sven, you make a really interesting point there, but how do we actually formalize this internally? So if we think about innovation, what is it really? Is it culture within the organization, or is innovation a specific business unit? Where does it really sit? So I don't know, Christina, could you maybe talk us through how you see that playing out?
Absolutely. So I think it's probably a little bit of both, but I think first and foremost, innovation has to enable the corporate strategy. And where is the company going over the next 5 to 10 years? What are the priorities? And innovation should really support that piece cross-functionally. So if our intent is to get to 10 transformational medicines in the next 10 years, how do we support that, from an innovation perspective? And it really is, has to be embedded in the culture. It has to be embedded in the incentives for all of us to get there. And I do believe that, innovation really has to live with everybody, in the company. And I think Jeff said it well at the beginning. As pharma, we've innovated in terms of the medicines that we bring to patients. That's been our that's been our wheelhouse for the next, for the past, a couple centuries. But at the same time, how do we get beyond that, right? To really support in a way that really enables the patient to get to the medicine, whether it's, supply chain, I'm sure with the work that Mike is doing, or whether it's looking at, data and analytics from what Kiva was talking about. So it really belongs to so many functions, to so many people across the company. But first and foremost, it has to support the corporate strategy. It has to be an enabler to that. So in terms of, having it be a separate business unit, I've seen it work well when it's part of where there's a function that's part of the corporate strategy within the company. And within that, I think it's really important to bring the functions and to bring the business along. It cannot be, a solution looking for a problem, but rather, starting with the business problem, the business question, and then working from there. You need the buy-in from the business, you need the buy-in from cross-functional partners, and you need the funds to make it happen, right? So I think starting at the center, embedding it into the different functions is probably, the most successful model I've seen so far. But others, please chime in.
I'd add into that just to say it's definitely the successful model that most of us have seen, but at the same time, don't assume that just because you're doing it that way, it's going to happen. There's a lot of really good leadership that's required to embed innovation in your culture, both at the strategic level to really think about what the future looks like and help the company organize and think about what might be possible, all the way down into process innovation and really helping people think differently about how to improve upon their current circumstances. I mean, innovation of yesterday is very different than the innovation of today, which will be different than innovation of tomorrow. We have access to data and understanding about our products, our services, our customers that we've never seen before. So how do we start embedding that understanding into the organization so that they can leverage it effectively? Not just at like I said, the strategic level where that's heavily leveraged, but also at the day-to-day process level. It kind of harks back a little bit, if you guys remember business process reengineering days and all that kind of stuff about how things need to be done differently and improved. And people start thinking about how to time processes. Well, this is different. Now we have data that represents a lot of that, and we can start using that information to really start setting new targets and new ways of working.
And Jeff, to build on that, I think it's the big I and the little I, right? So there's the big innovation, the big concepts, strategic initiatives. But every day, it's everyone's responsibility to make it a little bit better. Every day, that continuous improvement mindset, the way we've done in the past. I also think it's a big challenge between the nimble, smaller companies today versus the large, successful legacy pharma companies, that culturally is a big difference of how you move that different because they've been so successful as well.
Agree.
Yeah, and I would add that, there's also the fine balance between going from a world where we are much more used to a traditional process structured approach to a world where we're much more nimble and entrepreneurial in the way we're thinking, right? And so that change management aspect, I think, is a big part of really getting innovation embedded within the culture itself, and is really important part of what we do. It's not just about introducing new things. And then there's also the balance of, knowing that you want to federate innovation across the organization, but not creating fragmentation at the same time. So how do you align everybody to the right mission and right priorities?
Yeah, Sven, you're completely right. Particularly around, sorry, I've forgotten the first point there, but talking about embedding that culture and the change management aspect. And for me, innovation very much really revolves around the ability to fail fast and to understand that failure is not necessarily a negative thing, but it's that shift in the mindset to understand that trying things, and I think, Jeff, I think you said it, or maybe Sven earlier on when you talked about, we're very good at staging drugs. I think it was yourself, Sven, where we're very good at putting them through the different phases of drug development, but we haven't done that the same way with digital innovation. And I think that largely comes around because we're not treating it as an experiment, and we're not failing quickly at it, and understanding that failure is okay as well.
Some really interesting points there, actually. And, Mike, Sven, actually, Mike in particular, you made the point around everybody needs to make a small difference. And I think that's also critical. But maybe we need to think about innovation in a slightly different way, almost a tiered approach. So you've got small point scale innovation, but then you've got wider strategic innovation as well, as such as, Jeff and Kiva, you all mentioned this, and Christina. So I think we maybe need to differentiate that. And I was speaking to one of the CFOs from an African bank earlier this year, and he was saying that it's a company-wide cultural objective that everybody in their organization, from the tellers through to the C-suite, try to innovate their role in some way on a monthly and a quarterly basis. And they're measured on that. It's one of the outcomes that they're measured on, which is hugely important, especially when you get higher up, because then it becomes, of course, much more strategic, and that's just embedded in. But actually, Mike, let's stay with you, because I want to dig down into this a little bit more. When you're looking at driving digital innovation in an organization, what should you be looking at first? Who should you be looking at? Should you be looking at the organization, or should you be looking outside of the organization at your customers first? Where does that journey start?
Well, for us, in my opinion, Mike, we start outside. Too often I see companies, I see our company start inside, incremental improvement, and then at the end of innovation, what's considered innovation, you're looking at the customer. I see it very differently. You must start with the customer. And if you look at, we talked earlier about our new competition, such as Amazon. We all are customers and consumers of the Amazon experience. Our patients, our customers expect the same experience, just like we do. So for us, it's starting with the customer. We're going through a few initiatives today, including a control tower we're building out, but everything's centered around that customer experience. What are we doing to delight the customer? Because it's beyond just great products. People want and expect a great experience. So I think you start with great user design, you engage how the customers are working with you, and you build on there and you bring it inside from there.
If I can add on to that, Mike, I think it's a good point, but at the same time, I think there's a real challenge for pharma in this space and really understanding the customer. For many, many years, customers were at such an arm's length. It was really hard to understand the reality, what your medicine was doing to a given patient. And then let alone, the variability that would exist in how a physician was treating those types of patients that was happening around the world. So in big pharma organizations, it's really tough to try and synthesize all that into something that's really useful without accidentally what I would call over-interpreting, right? In terms of laying on your own views of what you think that experience should be like versus, to your point, really listening to the customer. I think Christina said it earlier, if experience and the customer experience is not well mapped out, well understood, then the reality is you don't know where you stand. And if we don't spend the time to really enable our employees, especially in the commercial space, to really understand that, take the time to kind of live and breathe in it for a while, it's hard to improve upon because they're just making guesses. You still want to unlock the ability for them to try new things, as was stated earlier, but you also want to make sure you're doing it in a relevance that truly is the experience versus what we want the experience to be, right?
I was going to say, Jeff, part of that's probably even observing, right? We're doing field observations to understand not how the customers tell us they use our products, but go out and observe it so you know and you know how to personalize it. And I think, Christina, you have some thoughts on that too.
No, I was going to add to that the tools that we have today in terms of data are really terrific to think about dynamic customer journeys where we social listening, for example, big data, looking at claims, looking at a longitudinal journey for a patient using claims data. I mean, it really gives us that bird's eye view and a very personalized, view as well into that customer and how they're interacting with our medicines, with their disease, with their own, lifestyle and their ecosystem, and how can we support them? How can we be part of that journey? And I think that's a significant change for for how innovation would thrive in our industry.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. We know there are examples of innovation coming from a leap of faith. Like, for example, Steve Jobs, who would have thought that, we would want to wander around with the internet in our pocket and an iPhone. But that's a very blue sky way of thinking. Whereas I think from a pharma industry perspective, we are much more grounded. We have the data because we have the patients. So we need to listen to the patients, to what they need, and to innovate around their needs to make sure they're getting exactly what they want, what they need. And if we can make it better, fantastic. But the biggest innovations are how do we make our patients' lives better and easier? And that's why we need to be so much more customer-centric.
Love that.
Yeah, I'd say there's a balance to that too, though, because a lot of times we think that in order for us to make their lives easier, we create the tool by which they need to use in order to make their lives better, and create this separate thing from their lives, and it becomes not as seamless as it could be. And I think now we really need to think about how are they actually operating in the world that they're in, and how can we actually seamlessly be a part of that and help them through the platforms and solutions they're already using, rather than continuously introducing new things. If you think about just a few years ago, we're in the world where everybody needed to create an app, and everybody had an app out there for everything. And I like to call them unitaskers, right? Like the old Food Network Elton Brown, I think, used to call those tools that you could only use for one thing. And we had, 5 people download them maybe? And then, what else did they do with them? So I think, we need to get beyond our, not invented here kind of syndrome, and really think about how we can start to integrate and create those seamless experiences for our patients as well.
Yeah, and I think... Sorry, Mike, go on ahead.
Yeah, I was saying we're looking very much at what we call the frictionless customer experience, right? And designing through our microservices and our API structures to have a no UI front end to make it very easy for our customers to interface rather than continually building new apps that's really creating more friction for them. Yeah.
And so, Sven, I was going to add on, one of the things that I think you're completely correct in, and one of the things that I think we need to work very hard is that we don't get what I refer to as innovation fatigue, where we hear that, we're burnt out in hearing the word innovation. And one of the things that I think we need to really look at is innovation is great, but if it is not implemented, we need to talk about the implementation of innovation. So, and that is exactly down to your thought around the apps. Are we implementing them just for the sake of it, or is it something that is going to blend into our patients' journey, into their lives without the maximum of disruption?
On that note, though, Aki, but wouldn't data and analytics have a key role to play in that, though? To understand.
Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
I'm sure data and analytics is a huge role to play in terms of understanding exactly how that new customer journey is going to impact your customers and your patients.
Yeah, completely. This is the thing, data and analytics is fantastic, but it can only get us so far. At the end of the day, we still need to have the capabilities embedded into the business close to the real questions. And otherwise fit for purpose solutions are never going to be developed to production. Data is fantastic, but we need the transforming the information into actual knowledge. And at the moment, that still needs the understanding of teams and the feedback loop that we have with regards to how we collect our data as well.
Isn't that also? Can I just make one point? Isn't there a slightly structural issue as well? It sounds quite siloed. Wouldn't we've seen a lot of industries start to break down their internal silos so that data and that kind of collaborative efforts, especially around innovation, is shared across business units.
Sorry?
No, I just said, how's that playing out right now in life sciences?
So for us, we are very much, the best way to describe it is what we're trying to do is we're unlocking the potential of the data that we have across the organization. And for me, it's really converting the data that we have and that we've generated into a commodity for the business. And I don't mean commodity in that we intend to sell it, but we intend to maximize the use of it. So our R&D data needs to be utilized into our manufacturing processes, and it needs to be utilized into our sales and backwards and forwards across the full spectrum, the full value chain. So you're exactly right. Data in itself, hidden in a silo, generated to answer one question, has finite, usage. Whereas when you start to think about that, and it's back to the change management thing and thinking about how we can really utilize the data across the business for our patients, it's when you are able to connect that, when you're able to catalog your data, when you have a federated data and analytics platform that's able to pull data from different areas of the business, that's when you start to see the full value of the data being generated.
No, it's extremely interesting, I must admit. There was a book I was reading recently called Sense Making, which is by Christian Meisberg, I think his name is, from Red Associates, and he talks about contextualized big data analysis. So he says big data analysis is hugely important, of course, as we've mentioned through this call, but overlaying the human experience on top of it is what really brings it to life. And within that book, they talk about a number of different examples of the way that that's worked out across client sites, which I find fascinating. But then let's switch topics slightly. And I want to bring Sven in for this one. Sven, we talk about digital disruptors, new entrants into the market. We've got biopharma, we've got technology organizations. How should we, as life sciences companies or pharma companies specifically, view these new entrants? Do we see them as the next big threat, or do we see them as an ally in driving our own innovation commitments?
I like that question, and I think it's a little bit And if we're going to be like a Kodak and just continue to do what we do and not think about change, then we're going to go that way as well. As these new entrants start to come in a big way. And if you look at some of these technology companies, almost every single one of the big ones, whether it's, Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, and so on, all of them have health teams, and they're hiring healthcare professionals to be part of that. So it's no longer about, if you want to work in healthcare, go to a pharma company. If you want to work in tech, go to a tech company, because both are crossing over. But certainly these big tech companies are starting to bring in the right type of talent to really empower their healthcare strategy. So on the one hand, I do think they are a bit of a threat, because think about Google or Alphabet. They have two life science companies. They have Calico and they have Verily. They're very much doing the things that we do in the R&D stage, at least. But then at the same time, the opportunity here is for us to partner with them, to learn from them, and they from us as well for the rest of the parts that they're not as heavily invested in yet. And so I think there is a really big opportunity to start to learn, partner, grow, and create that kind of close partnership to really understand the value that a big tech company with that customer experience first and data heavy sort of mentality can bring, versus a heavily deep science company that can really that has done this for a long time and can really bring that approach together with the tech companies to really start to form a new way of engaging and helping our patients.
Yeah, and it doesn't help, it doesn't hurt to have extra voices in the discussion with regulators. If we make more noise, that we have the more voices that are aligned on what we want to do from a digital innovation perspective and the use of data, the more that we have to support that and discuss that with regulators, the faster that we'll be able to move for our patients as well. And I think that's potentially where they could stand to be very much friends in that respect, because at the end of the day, I don't think anybody in any of these companies is working there exclusively for the money. I think that people specifically within the life sciences industry are very much have a purpose. They're very driven towards getting medications or solutions to patients quickly. So having those extra voices to support on a regulatory side is invaluable.
And if I can add to that, because I think there's nugget in there coming that I think is just brilliant, which is, I think in our industry now, even if we do talk to the tech, we talk to the startups, I think more and more the conversations are shifting towards, is there a common purpose, to your point, between them? Are they really trying to make a difference in a given community somewhere in the world? And can that be achieved in a more collective state? If the answer to that is yes, and they're starting to feel good, you're starting to see progress. Yeah, potentially even, real social impact potential. And I think that's a real kind of next gen pharma thinking, because I think it used to be more along the lines of what can we do to create, better opportunities, right, for the organization. But I think now it's about shifting gears and really understanding our purpose in what we do and making sure that we're partnering with people who have that equivalent. And it's tough right now, especially in this day and age with the way the world is this year. But I think those who really believe and really, find opportunity to share and to look for joint opportunities to make the world a better place. You're starting to see some really interesting deals pop up as it relates to that. So I think it's something that the industry at large really needs to kind of focus some energy towards.
And that's really interesting, because that goes back to my topic about customer-centric or patient-centric approaches first when you're looking at this. And it's really encouraging to hear that that's the way that the industry is going. We've seen a similar way of introducing the ecosystem into innovation in other industries. So the banking industry has been a forerunner in this with PSD2 introduction or regulation in Europe right now. It forced banks to open up their data to competitors, and that's what seems a huge threat. But a lot of banks actually used it as an opportunity to build collaborative and innovative networks across their peer group, and it was very, very effectively done. It's great to hear that same type of mentality is permeated into the life sciences market right now. Then, as we get more down to the nuts and bolts of making this happen, let's focus on a couple of core topics around how you really drive innovation internally. So we've mentioned culture, we've mentioned strategy. Let's build them up. Let's start with culture. I find that fascinating. So, Christina, actually, I'm going to pull you in for this one. What do you think is core to an innovative cultural engagement strategy with your employees and your staff? How do you build that? How do you make it happen?
I think there's a bit of a sponsorship spine that I think it's really important, right? So from, when you have, I mean, I'm speaking for Gilead, having Dan O'Day come in and really, speak to us about the importance of data as a strategic asset, innovation to support the corporate strategy, to support, the transformational medicines that we want to bring to market, and that begins to permeate across the organization in terms of really people feeling empowered that, innovation is in me. Innovation is just like the example you were describing at the beginning in terms of, one bank that was, essentially, in Africa telling all of their employees from a teller all the way to the C-suite, everybody has a role to play. I think it's just really, really important to begin to build that culture and that sentiment, in the organization. And then you create the right incentives, right? And the point about failing fast, I think, is also, in our industry, we traditionally get measured by, the good medicines we bring to market, right? But there's also an element of failure. For every medicine, there's 10 that didn't make it. So really thinking about, how do we continue to build on that risk taking so that it's seen as a plus as opposed to a failure, and how do we make sure that everybody's incentivized in the company to do just that? And it's not just coming up with the good ideas, but also thinking about, if somebody else came up with a good idea, how can I copy that and bring it into my function, because it may have a different iteration. Maybe it started in manufacturing, but it has a different iteration in commercial or in R&D that we can all benefit from. So I think it really, the cultural aspect of innovation is really, really critical, and ensuring that people do feel safe and incentivized to move innovation forward, whether it's a small step or a big step, becomes critical to the success of the organization.
So Christina, can I ask very quickly there, so what we're trying to do at the moment, and if you have examples or if you've experience on this, is when you talked about basically cross-pollinating initiatives, if it's been successful somewhere and rolling out best practice elsewhere, what we're really trying to do within Merck is that almost like a dual sponsorship level. So if it is something in R&D and if it is something in manufacturing that are very similar initiatives, how do we increase the scope of one of them and have two sponsors? So we have two areas of the business very much focusing on it. It reduces our redundancy, it reduces excess spend, and it speeds things up. And when we have that buy-in, we tend to be more successful. Have you seen the same as well?
Exactly. So I think it really is important to make sure that you do have that buy-in, that dual, triple sponsorship. And again, it goes back to, innovation should support the corporate strategy. So you have a corporate strategy, you have, the executive leadership team that has representatives from all of the functions, and, pieces of innovation that support that strategy should come to that table and be discussed in terms of, this happened in manufacturing, we should pull it through in commercial, et cetera, and then get the right sponsorship to ensure that it gets pulled through.
You also mentioned how do we incentivize employees? And I find that a fascinating topic. So what's your take on that?
I think, innovation awards are a terrific way to incentivize people. If you are, successful and have the right, you meet the right KPIs, you meet the right, metrics, then it's, it's very easy to sort of perhaps put it into your goals and put some pay around it, just like you would in sales. But I do think that incentive is really important. And it also, when you fail, it's important that take the lessons and incentivize people to speak up and share what they learned and share what could have been done better. I mean, innovation is iterative, right? It may be that we learn something that we're going to scale up. Maybe not all the parts are going to get scaled up, but the parts that we learn, we can learn from and then move them forward, not in the way we had expected, perhaps at the beginning of the journey, but the parts that did work, how do you take the learnings and bring that forth to drive further innovation?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And Something I've heard from a number of my clients in the past is that focus around incentivizing your people around business outcomes as opposed to just KPIs that don't really mean too much for the business in the wider scheme of things. Sorry, Mike, you have a point.
Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, for me, part of this is building a culture, an expectation and collaboration around innovation. I think is so important, including building out really diverse teams. You need some coming out of universities as well as people that have been around the organization to get things done. One of the things we did in my former team was we built out an innovation garage, and we created innovation, and that helped as well around prototyping and helping people visualize innovation too.
And if I could add one thing, I think, to have that culture, you talk, as a culture, you talked about the sponsorship from the top down earlier, Christina, which I absolutely believe in as well. But the nurturing of that. So even in the incentivization that you're trying to identify now with, I think there's something else though. I think there's a leadership accountability around innovation that sometimes, honestly, I think other people kind of look at other parts of the organization and say, that's their job. I got to run the business over here. And that's where you start to break the culture down a little bit. I think as leaders in any organization of any function, there has to be recognition that if you truly want to change your business, then as leaders, you have to do that in a collective way. And I don't mean everybody suddenly innovating all independently, because that does create chaos. I'm thinking more along the lines of just agreeing about, hey, how do you run the business and how do you change the business? And I think it was said earlier, what are you doing to change your piece of the pie today? And how does that impact the other folks around you? And I think that's an important aspect of leaders that gets missed, that's their role. They need to understand that they have that accountability to drive it through. And if they don't have it, then the reality is, are they the right leaders to be running your business if you're truly trying to make your company an innovative company? I think there's definitely something there that often gets overlooked that needs to be dealt with.
Is it a bandwidth issue as well? So, I completely agree with you, Jeff, but, sometimes you see leaders and you speak to them and all they're concerned about is just keeping the lights on because there's so many structural issues that they're trying to overcome that innovations almost seems to take a back seat.
That's a good shot. I mean, you got to run the business and change the business at the same time to really affect in this day and age. If you can't do that, then the reality is you haven't thought about how to run your shop well enough, or you need to be looking at, how can you change the way you are running your shop to free up that ability to think differently about what needs to be done, for the future. And I think there's this whole aspect of kind of future forward, looking that a leader always has to have and to think about what that means for their business of today, and then make sure that they see that coming and be able to prepare for it. And then make sure other people are aligned to and understanding what you're trying to do. That actually alleviates some pressure, on the day-to-day sometimes if you do it correctly. But it has to be for the purpose, the common purpose.
Yeah, I agree. And also I think, we put an awful lot on leaders within the company as having accountability, but one of the biggest things that I think leads to a more innovative thinking is the accountability to empower their own team. So it doesn't necessarily mean that all leaders need to be doing it themselves, because like you said, the vast majority of their job is keeping the lights of the business on. But if they have the right mindset and the right culture to empower their own teams, that I think is a leadership behavior that is equally relevant. Yeah.
Agree.
I think also, with innovation, we often think of it as, iterative and creative and free form, but actually you can create process around it that encourages people to think about it as their part of their daily jobs, right? A very common way to approach this is the 70-20-10 rule, right? So 70% of your job should be keeping the lights on, business as usual stuff. 20%, what's that incremental innovation stuff that are more or less sure bets or things that you can really experiment with, but has a pretty good chance of having a good outcome. Then 10% could be more of the transformational, disruptive stuff that you want to just take a big bet on. Those are common type of processes and structures that you can sort of build into a culture that to really start to think about this as adopting it as part of what they do, not taking over what they do.
Is that quite similar to what Google does with their innovation kind of strategy?
Well, I think Google as a whole is a company where they have many different groups. I mean, they've got Google X, they've got Verily, they've got different pockets where they start to, move things outside of the main group and move into different specific groups that focus on that. But in the early days, when they were a much smaller company, they did have what they called the 20% rule. I don't know if it was ever a formal written rule, but what they wanted to do was give all their employees 20% of their time to actually focus on something they were passionate about, right? And they encouraged that. And in fact, a lot of the Google platforms and solutions that came out, whether they worked or not, those that went into beta and testing came out of that 20% time.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some really good examples of the products that came out of that. That's fascinating. So we're reaching the end of our chat. I can't believe we've got through almost 40 minutes already. But what I want to give is everybody in the audience just a bit of a takeaway, something that people in the audience can utilize tomorrow within their function. So I'm going to go a bit of a round circle around the group. Can you give us and our listeners one snippet that you would give, one snippet of advice that you would give to make and to enhance innovation journeys in our listeners' organizations tomorrow? So let's start with Kiva. Do you want to kick us?
Okay, so cool. So for me, what I would say is work on the basics. You know, your data governance strategy might not be the sexiest thing within your organization, but the faster you can access and use high quality data, the quicker you can operationalize innovative use cases.
Brilliant. Christina.
Start and end with the patient in mind, with the customer in mind. In the end, we have to fit into their world. It's not the other way around. So use the data, use your tools, use whatever it takes to make sure that you always have the patient as, first and foremost.
Brilliant. Sven?
Yeah, I think start with the problem or pain point first. Don't try to solve it by yourself. Get the diversity of perspectives, as well as think about the impact both upstream and downstream, not just where you're solving it for. Then ultimately, don't think of it as a full and final process. Think about it as an iterative process where you're adapting and optimizing along the way based on data and insights you're getting once you finally execute on it.
Perfect. Mike?
I would say challenge the status quo. I think it's really important at all levels that as you work, don't take no as an end result. Keep challenging, keep pushing, get gritty in order to persevere.
Brilliant. And then Jeff?
A lot of great stuff already said. The only thing I'd probably just add on to there is be careful not to over-process innovation. I think it needs to be recognized it's more of an art form than a science sometimes, and it's imperative that people understand how to get that balance right. If you over-process it, over-systematize it, it falls flat. People don't feel the passion behind it. If you really want to unlock that passion, you got to allow for it. So don't put so much system or process in place that squelches it.
Fantastic. Great. We've got 5 really good points there. And everybody, thanks so much for your time on the panel. It's been great talking to everybody. Personally, I've really enjoyed it. I hope our listeners did. So Jeff, Mike, Kiva, Christina, Sven, it's been fantastic speaking to you all today. And to our audience as well, thanks so much for listening in. We're going to have some questions in a bit. But we also, once those questions are finished and we have our coffee break later on, we implore you to go through our experience zone and to look at the booths we have there. And we trust you'll enjoy the rest of today, but then also the last day that we have on our summit moving forward. So thanks very much for everybody tuning in, and we look forward to the questions coming through in a bit. Hi. Well, many thanks for staying around for the questions. We hope you enjoyed the panel. We've got everybody rearing and ready to go to answer your specific questions. We've got around 17 minutes, so I think we should dive right in. The first question, we're actually going to aim at the entire panel, as I think it's a specifically good point related to the question or the panel that we've had. Are there any... is there a specific success story of digital innovation that the panelists could share from either their own company or what they see elsewhere as a best in practice example? So let's go left to right here. Mike, would you like to start?
Sure. I would share an example where we had at CEC a couple of years ago, the Consumer Electronics Show, our senior vice president commit to put a production product line into the commercial business within 90 days. And they came back and asked us to do it. So the speed, the commitment really drove a lot of innovation, and we were able to do that as around healthcare technology. So I think part of this is making that commitment, getting it out commercially, and then understanding how to deliver that in an iterative manner was a part of our innovation there.
Brilliant. Christina.
So for us at Gilead, a very important group of patients and consumers that we support is folks that need HIV prevention drugs. So we started to think about this population in terms of being digital natives, and really how do we support them, in their terms? How do we create a product that helps, consumers access PrEP in a way that it's intuitive and can really bring all these disparate pieces that are required to get PrEP into one platform. So we co-created with consumers to do just that, and launch actually right in the middle of the pandemic, thinking about bringing integrations with telemedicine, with home RX delivery, with home testing, et cetera, so that again we could support those consumers in their terms. And it was really, I think, a matter of co-defining the goals and the issues that we were looking to solve with the business, with the teams, and then taking bold moves to go after it. So we're in the market right now, and so far so good. So it's been exciting to be able to deliver that for patients.
Brilliant, thank you. Kiva.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, always best innovation really does come out of business need, and particularly on purpose. One of the things that I think we have done very, very well within Merck in Germany here is that in our R&D organization, we have developed a fantastic platform for ingesting and curating and integrating large quantities of omics data. So that really allows for the ability for cross-portfolio analysis, self-serve use cases, and app development on that data, which obviously is consented for correctly, to really drive specifically targeted potential for biomarker target identification for next generation disease understanding, and also next generation drug development, companion diagnostic development.
Right. Ashwin?
Thanks, Michael. I won't speak about anything specific to my current organization since I'm still reasonably new, but certainly in previous organizations within the last 5 years, I was involved in the clinical development space, and one of the things that we did there was really start to look at how to address every step of the clinical journey for patient recruitment through to randomization, and really address different parts of that, and leveraging new tools, technologies, and thinking about it more from a process where we want to make sure that we're converting as many qualified patients as possible, and trying to qualify the patient as early as possible, and then hand-holding at the point of, from referral to the site is all important things that we did. Whether not all of it was digital innovation per se, but certainly was innovative in the way that we were doing it. And ultimately, not just purely because of digital, but because of all the things that we did, that study actually ended up closing a month early, which is almost unheard of.
Yeah, fantastic. And then lastly, Jeff.
Yeah, on my end, I'd say there's kind of two major criteria which define successful innovation that I've seen so far. If I look back at the few organizations I've worked for, there is a pattern there a little bit. The first one is when we've actually collaborated effectively with either a provider or a patient organization and really focused our energy in making change, right? And doing things different and trying to make things better, and working side by side with those organizations to do exactly that. And in some cases, I would argue that the definition of success was actually it didn't work. And we learned a lot, right, in terms of what needed to be done for the next round. And the second criteria for that, I would argue, is consistently applied across successful innovation. It's when it's from a top-down perspective, it's aligned, right? When everybody's agreeing that this is something we want to do, it's something we want to try, that passion's there, and that motivation and focus is all provided. So if you get that passion, motivation, strategy, leadership alignment combined with a collaborative effort from outside of your organization, that defines success.
Absolutely, and that relates to what Kiva was saying during the panel. Fail fast, but also learn faster, I suppose, as well. So the next question I really like is, how do you balance roles, responsibilities, and investments in digital innovation between global and then regional and local levels? What makes sense to sit where? So I think, Mike, could you tackle this one for us?
Sure, Mike. In my experience, innovation has to be driven by the business and customer needs closer to the actual localized business. So for me, I think a lot of this is about driving it close to the business, driving innovation, doing some fail fast and learn test there. And then a global team can bring scale. What they can do is help drive the resourcing, the scale, the reuse, and measurements to adopt the change and put that innovation into production. And I think that's the balance that you're always looking to strike. One of the things we're doing, and actually one of my partners, Sasha Koff, I think is in the session today, driving governance around this so that we can drive really global adoption, but keeping the localized teams empowered.
Yeah, fantastic. That's a very, very good point there. And then this next question, again, it's quite interesting as well. And I think there's definitely a personal touch to this question. It starts off, innovation is hard and requires a lot of people management to be implemented correctly. I've come across internal senior stakeholders who are continuously going after the next shiny thing rather than having the patience to sit and test and experiment, which obviously takes time and budgets. How do you change that across a pharmaceutical organization today? Sven, would you like to pick this one up for us?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think that's the key thing about innovation, especially in big corporate environments, is the hardest part is going to be the change management and the cultural and behavior change that needs to happen across the organization. It's hard because partly everybody nowadays has so much access to both digital solutions as well as access to interactions with startups. It's not hard to do that. And so everybody thinks it's on their agenda, rightly so, to think innovatively, to think about engaging with these platforms. But what we need is an enterprise level organizational structure that really starts to put in place the process, not just for how to start with the problem first and then evaluating the right type of solution partners that you may want to engage with, as well as to bring them in and test them in a way that's much more experimental, to really think about more of the MVP first rather than just going straight to an implementation. But also, what is the cultural change around that, and how can you not only educate people through more of an academic means, but also provide them the experience to be much more, have much more access to going through this process of experimentation? How do we give them the opportunity to think more like a product manager of a platform rather than a project manager for a vendor, right? So creating these processes and the opportunities to learn through experience, I think, are key parts of this. And then working with the right channels in the organization to drive that change management through education, through exposing them to external cultures and external knowledge. All these things are important. So it's not just one person's job or one group's job. It needs to be a complete company commitment to actually drive this throughout the organizational mindset.
Great. And who would you say in the organization are those channels that can really change and drive that change management?
Well, I think, oftentimes most companies now have innovation groups, so it might start there, but really it needs to be working across the organizations with all the functional units, with all the leaders, to really start getting it in their minds what these things mean and why it's important for their teams. Because ultimately, if it's just somebody's night and weekend sort of activity, it's never really going to be all that meaningful because it's not part of their objectives. It's not part of what they're actually going to be in a sense, given credit for. So it needs to be incentivized in the sense that, they need to be able to see why it's important to think this way, to change the way they approach things, and not be just, allowed to do whatever they want because they've got the budget and go with the first company they think is right because they haven't really looked at any others, and that's the first shiny object they see.
Brilliant. And actually, this next question touches on a couple of points that you've spoken about, but also Mike's previous point. So this question, in regards to global innovation transparency, how do you as global organizations share these innovations across the globe so teams are aware of the innovation that they can adopt in their own areas? I find this very difficult as we end up having many teams trying to innovate on the same process or the same program. So let's, Christine, would you like to pick this one up?
Yeah, I think that is indeed a challenge. And I think, when you have really able country teams, for example, that move quickly and, they see a problem and they want to address it. I think it's just having the discipline to sort of get together at the center and say, okay, let's sort of make sure that we're pulling on the best practices and creating the right forums and opportunities to do so. I think we learned with the pandemic, again, how quickly the countries moved to action. And there were so many best practices, sort of following the trajectory of the virus of what people did first in Asia, then in Europe and in the US. So creating that opportunity and there's technology that you can use to help share those best practices, but I think there's also the value of the conversation, right? What worked? What didn't work? What did you learn? We were finding that, what worked in April didn't work in July. So being able to be nimble and move quickly was really important. And the value of the learnings was key. And also, how do you incentivize people, right? Not just to sort of come up with a good idea, but to copy a good idea. So, in my prior company, we had a innovation award that also had a pirate award, right? So not only the person that came up with this idea, but also the person who copied it and implemented it successful, in their country. So I think there's some neat things that you can do, but obviously that human element and the conversation is really, really important. Let me turn it over to Keva, because I think you've done some really neat things at Merck as well.
Yeah, so what we're doing at the moment actually is working at, very similarly to what you said, Christina, that you're totally right. With the speed of the movement or during the pandemic, what we're finding is some of our countries are doing incredible stuff. And what we realized is that what we want to do is elevate those, and we really want to move those out so that we're using, like you said, the best practices across the organization. And what we've done there is we've actually implemented a new organization, a digital and data, and particularly a transformation organization within the group, to really have a central focal point whereby people have the ability to really feedback in, and there is a feedback mechanism both at a global functional and local level in the future, so that we can really highlight and lift up those excellent work that's being done. And to touch on another point, I think one of the things that is very, very key, and you alluded to that as well, Christina, is it's about communication. And I know that sounds like one of the simplest and most basic things, but we need people to be talking about. We're very, very good as an organization and as an industry to go heads down, this needs to be done, let's do it, and let's move on and get it done for the patients. But what we actually need to do is, particularly on a country level, is talk about how good we're doing things at country levels and share that learning, whether we have newsletters, whether we have, success and failure sessions whereby people come and present to the organization, so that we really elevate what is being done, and go back to the communication point of how we share what we know.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
No, a lot of good points there. We've probably got time for either one or two more questions. So I want to quickly point to this question now, purely because instead of internal innovation, it's speaking about industry-wide innovation here and some specific examples around that. So the question is, the patient is generally consuming a number of different medications from different organizations, and the HCP who's treating them has to tailor-make a solution for every single individual patient. Are there any integrated examples of innovation here within the industry? Jeff, do you want to pick this one up?
Sure. I think the obvious answer to that in all aspects is no. I don't think the pharma industry has really kind of taken hold of that very well yet. I know there's a lot of conversations about it, and there's attempts, like I said earlier, to work with provider networks and others to do things. I would actually argue that the innovation in this space is actually happening outside of our industry. There's a lot of organizations, some tech-based organizations, some process health organization-based innovations that are happening, where you're starting to see people stitch together healthcare processes and data for the betterment of the individual. There's a great example I know of in Ireland, where there's a company that's specifically focused on doing exactly that, and working with the Irish healthcare authorities to make it seamless, to make it so that there is a common health record, there's common understanding of how an individual patient can understand what's happening with themselves and their health. you could argue that, if you look at Estonia and some of the stuff that's been going on there for many years, and in Scandinavia as well, that stitching has been happening over time as well. But there's also companies and over the past 3 or 4 years that have popped up that are, that's their sole purpose, is to figure out that common platform across various different disease areas and health conditions to make it more uniform or tailored to the individual needs of a given patient. So it's about how we work with them. It's about how we collaborate effectively, how we help them become smarter about our disease areas so that we're not left behind in that process. So we're ensure that the understanding of the science and the patients that we have does get embedded into those innovations, and maybe by chance we can work with them, to help facilitate some of that more effectively. So simple answer is, I don't think we're doing it as an industry. I think we need to figure out how to do it with those that are really striving and driving outside of our industry.
So this is really interesting. That point touches on something that's happening across industries. You're starting to see the blurring of the lines between industries now. As you say, between tech and pharma, tech and banking, it's all starting to break down and merge to a certain degree. And it's probably one of the cornerstones of innovation across industries as we move forward, as you get these new market entrants that don't have specific legacy within that market. But really interesting questions. We've actually somehow managed to get to the end of the session already. That seems to blast by in a matter of seconds. Thanks so much for everybody's time on the call today. I really appreciate all the panelists' time, but also everybody that's listened in. So we implore you to listen to the next keynote, which is Scott Gottlieb. He's going to be the next keynote. And if you have the time, please come and join us in the experience zone. I'll be on the stand, but so will many of the other people from across Indigen and across our other organizations. Thanks for joining on day 2, and we hope to speak to you soon.